Welcome to Beyond Bitewings, the business side of dentistry, brought to you by Edwards & Associates PC. Join us as we discuss how to build your dental practice, optimize your income, and plan for your future. This podcast is distributed with the understanding that Edwards & Associates PC is not rendering legal, accounting, or professional advice. Listeners should consult with their business advisors before acting on any of the information that is shared. At Edwards & Associates PC, our business is the business of dentistry. For help or more information, visit our website at eandassociates.com.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Beyond Bitewings. My name is Ash, and here in the studio we have Robert.
Good afternoon.
And over a Zoom phone call, we have Joe MacGregor, whom we've had previously in one of our other episodes. He's a prominent attorney, and we actually have a few, let's just say, staff-related questions for Joe that we will be asking him today during this episode. So, Joe, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are the two of you?
Well, we're looking forward to the weekend, that's for sure.
No, I can't wait.
All right. That makes three of us.
Good. Well, we've had a lot of questions, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of questions too from dental staffs around the country and around North Texas, specifically having to do with the vaccine and what can my employer demand of me and what am I required to disclose to him, and I don't know where to start. What kind of advice do you have for the dentists out there that have a staff? I mean, I don't have a specific question, but I do down the road, I know.
I have one question.
Okay, go ahead.
One big question, which is, as an employer, can I require all my employees to get vaccinated for COVID?
Yeah. So that's a fun question. This is a question that we also get. Now, on the surface, the answer is pretty simple and straightforward, which is yes, you can. Oh. Now, with everything in law, there's always exceptions and caveats, and that's probably what we're going to have to talk a little bit about. And so maybe Ash, yes, the answer to your question is yes, and then Robert, maybe the place to start is talking about those exceptions. And I think when we talk about something like this, it's important for everyone because I know that there will be listeners who are not just in Texas.
That's what I was going to say. What about states other than Texas?
Yeah. So maybe we'll start with the general framework. In a weird way, you kind of have to talk about like how American law has been formed theoretically, and we could talk for days about how true this is or is not, but theoretically, states make their own laws. Right. Mm-hmm. And we theoretically volunteer certain laws to apply across the board. And that's the good people there in DC, they create laws that should apply across the board, but every state's allowed to make their own rules. And the reason that's important is because from the very get-go, when we're talking about dental offices, most dental offices are small businesses. Mm-hmm. And in order to give the federal government the authority to make laws for us, for the most part, they're making laws that are not for small businesses. They're doing things that one of the reasons that they're able to make laws is commerce that goes across state line. And then there are other reasons, but that's the one we probably care about the most. And so when we look up, when we talk about a rule like this, what we're doing is we're looking for who has authority to say, yes, you do. Yes, you can create these rules about vaccines, or no, you cannot. And there are essentially two groups of authorities. And the first one's the state. So every single person has to look at their own state. Here in Texas, we have one state rule that has applied, that has passed, and been signed by the governor. But there are three other laws that relate to vaccines and whether or not you can allow them. There's three more up for bid. So this, by the time this gets published, who knows? Well, actually, I think they just finished their legislative session. But anyway, point is this is going to change, and it's highly politicized at the moment, whether we like it or not. Yeah. But Texas's rule says, hey, if you are basically, I guess to make it simple, you can't require vaccine cards. But the other rules are saying, no, you can't even say, like one in particular is saying, you cannot force your employees to get vaccines. So the answer to this will change state to state. I know Montana has had, they're pushing to make this, change my answer. And just really quickly shifting over to the federal side, when we're looking at things like who makes the rules here, well, EEOC and some of these rules, the organizing bodies and rule makers, these apply at different levels. This is where it gets kind of complicated, where a lot of what we're talking about only applies to businesses that have 15 or more employees. And so sometimes we look on the internet, can I force my employees to have vaccines or not? Well, you might find something that actually doesn't apply to your business of 6, 14, or whatever. So anyway, with all of that being said, at the end of the day, yes, the law, I guess I should say, law does not prohibit an office from insisting that if you are going to return back to physical work in the office, that you must have a vaccine.
Okay, but the current law doesn't prohibit that, but you're saying these 3 laws that are in the works may prohibit that later.
That is right. Right. That's right. We may have to record a different podcast, Robert, to change what we just, because the people who have that authority are actually talking about it at the moment. Now, I don't know if this answer is going to get changed. It looks like the places where there's the more political will to do something is trying to prohibit the quote unquote vaccine passports. And so that's where most of the target, then that's an easy thing to pass, it appears, and some that relate to doing business with the state. Now, the reason that dentists may care about that is if you're enrolled in Medicaid and you're getting, that's one of your third-party payers, well, there's a question of whether or not a law like that would implicate, because it basically, one of the proposals is like, you can't, if you are insisting that your employees be vaccinated, then you basically can't do business with the state. So, and this is one of those things, this law that's happening in mid-process that sometimes we don't have answers yet for all the minutia that would happen. So the best hope for our audience here is that something like that doesn't pass, because I do think that that's a possibility.
Well, and as you said, the legislative session here in Texas just ended. So if these 3 laws are taken back up by the next session, what's the timing on that?
I don't know. I actually don't know when exactly they regroup, but I do know that one of the bills appears to have met approval in both houses in the Texas. Texas is the capital. Looks like some of the other states may be a little further along though.
Okay. So you think if something changes in Texas, it might be in the fall?
That's what I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it changes at all, I think that, like I said, it's highly politicized, and it's going to be about momentum and whether or not these are going to be priorities when the lawmakers return.
Okay, let me ask you this. As an attorney, it may be too early for this, but have you seen any cases where the employer required the vaccinations, the employee refused, was terminated, and then filed a wrongful termination lawsuit?
So I haven't seen any yet, but that is a possibility. Now, the state of Texas, and I think for the most part, most of the listeners here, that theoretically could happen. And you would make the argument, your argument in a dental office is that everyone is in close contact with each other. There's not a lot to do in a dental office that isn't in relative proximity to your coworkers.
It's very difficult to
And
be
therefore,
socially distanced in a dental office.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right, exactly. We're not talking about corporate offices that may have a call center or whatever. We're talking about the traditional office that has,
right,
a handful of operatories and stuff like that. And therefore, because there does need to be, a business interest in having this. And of course, you're saying, well, it's because we come into close contact. And if I lose my staff, one or more of my staff, that actually impacts my business. And so I don't anticipate that very many people will win those lawsuits, those wrongful terminations. I think that it seems to be pretty clear that an employer can terminate someone for refusing to get a vaccine. I think there's enough literature out there to say they can. Now, this is not old enough to know under what are all the circumstances that someone could win a wrongful termination case. There are two primary exemptions from something like this. One is whether or not you have a disability that may prevent you from getting the vaccine, and the other being a firmly held, sincere religious belief about getting the vaccine. So,
okay,
so I think the only times you would lose a wrongful termination is when you fail to make what they call a reasonable accommodation for one of those two.
Okay, so here's sort of in my mind, a logical follow-up question. If the employer terminates the employee because they refuse to get the vaccine, and then later the rules change, would the employee then bring the lawsuit under the new law, or is that not permissible since he fired the person under the old law?
Yeah, we would track basically the calendar when it happened. It was permissible. Lawmakers could go back and say, hey, if someone, they could theoretically say, hey, you could go back and chase after your employer. That's not very common.
Okay. So to some degree, it sounds like the employers have some rights and are, at least to some degree, have some legal protection.
Yeah, that's right. I think, the overall idea here is that they probably have more legal protection than you would expect.
Okay. Well, good. Ash, do you have anything to add?
Just one other thing. I know he had mentioned about the two exemptions. I've also heard of certain employees that are pregnant that may sometimes refuse to take the vaccine because they think there's not enough research out there to talk about the long-term effects on, the infant or the fetus that's growing inside them.
Right. There's a lot of rumors about the vaccines actually making people sterile.
Right. Okay. So my understanding, of course, I'm not a doctor, right? So I don't know the veracity of the claims about sterility. From what I understand, our medical practice here, I don't believe that those are
valid exemptions.
I wouldn't say illegitimate, but okay. From what I understand, it's not a real thing. However, the pregnancy is indeed one of the exemptions. For better or for worse, we do consider pregnancy to be a disability.
Oh.
And reasonable accommodations would be made. So that's someone from a very practical matter.
I see.
You wouldn't push that on a pregnant employee because they're probably going to win that lawsuit. You would be. Now we could get into the weeds about how someone, how if you just insisted on letting them go. I actually think that dental offices, like we were talking earlier, everybody works in close proximity to each other. I actually think you have a claim for still terminating that person. So even though there's an exemption, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't do it. It just means that you're required to make an accommodation for that person. So for instance, if there was a way to allow that person to work without interacting with the other people in the office, and that's why I think it's a little impractical in a dental office, but if it's a dental assistant, then you might not be able to make a reasonable accommodation for the dental assistant. But if it is someone who just handles insurance claims, maybe you can. And so that's where it gets a little dicey. But yes, pregnancy is considered a disability as far as this conversation is concerned.
Is it legal for employers to offer incentives to their staff to get vaccinated?
It is not illegal. And I would almost argue that that's probably the easier legal way to approach this, but it does come down to the business owner, because there's a difference between saying, I insist that every single person who works have the vaccine, and I think it's a good idea that as many possible employees have the vaccine. And it just happens to be an approach, and it's a business decision. But yes, offering incentives is a valid approach. So, and one thing before I forget, one thing that probably doesn't apply to dental offices, but arguably applies, and something that you would want to look up in your state. But there are sometimes requirements that if you are going to force people to get a vaccine, you're required to make accommodations for them to go get it. I think there's an argument that if they take 2 hours to go get the vaccine, then they could do that on the clock. So,
okay, good to know. Good, very important. Ash?
Yeah. I was also thinking about this other thing. So let's say you've made it mandatory for all your employees to go get vaccinated for COVID. Mm-hmm. Is it okay for the employer to ask for the vaccine cards as proof to see if they've actually gotten vaccinated?
100%. It is absolutely okay. But one important issue here is that if you're going to keep record of that, to document it in some way, mm-hmm. It is not okay to put this with personnel file. Oh. So it has to be kept in a separate file, or just exposure of confidential information, confidential health information. Oh. It's not directly a HIPAA issue because they're not your patient. So it's a little bit different, but the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and some of these other tangential rules, they come prepackaged with their own confidentiality rules, and that is one of them.
I see.
So you are allowed to ask for a copy of or some proof that they were vaccinated.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yep. Everything probably bears mentioning that basically everything that we're talking about here falls under that. You could, I think the days of testing have probably gone away, but that falls under the same rules. So if you can do thermometer checks, but if you're going to keep data on that, you have to put it in that. You have to keep the data. You have to put it somewhere that's not the personnel file.
So like a separate medical file or something.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. Interesting. Very relevant information today. So Ash, do you have any further questions? And Joe, do you have anything else you want to add before we wind up?
No, I don't think so. Like I said, it's a little bit more straightforward than I think a lot of people will realize. But again, it would be wise to consult local rules.
And also, it sounds like still developing. The law on this is still developing.
Right. Yeah, that's right. This episode may come with a short expiration. So, but that is how this works. That is how this works, and that's what keeps the lawyers employed. If it always changes, there's always a job.
The Full Employment Act.
There we go. Hey, we know how to look after each other.
Right. Okay, Ash, anything else?
No, that was it. I think Joe covered pretty much everything that I had on my mind, and this list in front of me with all the questions.
Super. Okay, Joe, thanks very much for being with us today.
Hey, thank you guys. Absolutely.
Ash,
appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, it was a pleasure. And again, our fellow listeners, if you guys have questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@eandassociates.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you guys, and we look forward to our next episode.
Thanks for listening today. Be sure to subscribe to Beyond Bitewings on your favorite podcast platform. For more info, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, or reach out to us on our website. You can also shoot us an email at info@eandassociates.com.